442nd Regimental Combat Team, earning honor through triumph.
People of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast were placed in internment camps after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. On March 23, 1943, they were given the option of serving in the 100th/442nd Regimental Combat Team. The 100th/442nd had many battlefield triumphs and tragedies, and also helped stop discrimination against Japanese Americans, turning a tragedy into a triumph.
A country with a failing economy, dropping wages. This was Japan in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Between 1886 and 1911, more than 400,000 Japanese left for the U.S., a country with a booming economy. They settled mainly in Hawaii and the Pacific coast.
Once in America, though, they faced discrimination and prejudice along with their fellow Asians. In the early 1900s, discriminatory laws, such as the Alien Land Law, were passed. These have been headed by other discriminatory acts against Asian immigrants, like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882.
A Japanese Exclusion League was formed in 1905, and it began to pass laws preventing the Japanese from becoming citizens, owning land, holding certain jobs, marrying people outside their race, and buying homes in certain areas. They were denied service and barred from places. In 1924, the Immigration Act of 1924 was created, and immigration from Japan to the United States was stopped altogether.
On December 7, 1941, Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. The next day, Congress declared war on Japan, plunging the country into World War II. The discrimination against the Japanese Americans immediately worsened, and suspicion flourished. All Japanese Americans, even citizens, were classified as 4C, or enemy aliens. Signs popped up on shop doors and windows. "We don't serve Japs here. Get out, Jap rat. No Japs here."
I think, Mr. Justice, that there is no doubt that majority of the younger Japanese of the third generation of American citizens will immediately turn over to their own race. They would go over to the other side.
Angus Taylor Jr., stating his attitude towards local Japanese, January 6, 1942.
On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066. All people of Japanese ancestry living in war zones on the West Coast were placed into internment camps. Japanese American people were bitter. The successful and comfortable lives they built up had been torn away from them. The internment camps were crowded, and there was very little privacy. These camps were in the middle of barren territory and also behind barbed wire with armed guards.
They couldn't trust us, so therefore it was something that we had to do. We had to change the way that the American people looked at us. But the only way they'll believe us is if we're willing to give our lives.
100th Infantry Battalion was created as an experiment, and with amazing results, the Japanese Americans, or Nisei, were given a chance to show their patriotism.
With the need for a large number of troops in Europe, President Roosevelt decided to allow Nisei to serve in segregated units. They were reclassified as 1A, eligible to enlist and be drafted. On March 23, 1943, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was created, the perfect opportunity for Nisei to prove their loyalty to the United States.
The 442nd began training at Camp Shelby in Mississippi. Most regiments trained for only a few months before entering combat, but the Nisei trained for almost a full year before fighting, as many of the generals still mistrusted the Japanese Americans. In September of 1943, the 100th Battalion was finally shipped overseas to Europe, with the 442nd following in April of 1944.
In June 1944, the 442nd entered combat north of Rome, where the 100th Battalion was incorporated. The 100th was allowed to keep its designation due to its outstanding combat record. Soon after, the 442nd, now known as the 100th/442nd, was attached to the 36th Infantry Division under the leadership of General John E. Dahlquist.
In the winter of 1944, the 100th/442nd was set to the task of rescuing the 1st Battalion in the 141st Regiment of the 36th Texas Division, which was trapped in the Vosges Mountains. Hitler had ordered his troops to defend the area at all costs, and the lost battalion was surrounded and running out of food and ammunition. Finally, after 5 days of fierce combat, the lost battalion was finally rescued. The 442nd faced a tragedy here, though. They had suffered casualties several times the number of men they had rescued. At the end of the fighting here, 200 Nisei were dead and 800 were wounded.
In the process, the 442nd had liberated the towns of Brieres, Belmont, and Bifontaine. The 442nd had faced fierce enemy fire and strong defense at these places, many of which had been important locations for the Allies to hold. During this period, the 442nd continued to demonstrate the bravery and valor it was known for in its battles, but at a bloody price. The inhabitants of these towns continued to honor the 442nd with monuments, museums, and streets named in their honor.
In April 1945, General Mark Clark of the 5th Army specifically asked for the 100th/442nd to break the Gothic Line. The Gothic Line was a German defensive line along the summits of the northern part of the Apennine Mountains. Allied efforts to break it had been going on unsuccessfully for nearly half a year. The 100th/442nd, however, managed to break through the German defenses after a nighttime march up the steep slopes of Mount Forgerito, and thus allowed the Allies to push the German defenses back until they finally surrendered on May 2, 1945.
At last, World War II ended in Europe on May 7, 1945. American troops began to travel back to the U.S., but there were still challenges to be met by these Nisei veterans.
Due to their excellent service and bravery in World War II, the 442nd soon became one of the most decorated units in history. The 442nd was eventually awarded 7 Distinguished Unit Citations, 21 Medals of Honor, over 4,000 Purple Hearts, 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 588 Silver Stars, and more than 4,000 Bronze Stars.
Unfortunately, the 442nd tragically lost 800 men, either killed or missing in action.
I cried when we came off the line. I was, where the hell are all my friends?
Fred Shiosaki, Nisei soldier, December 7, 2016.
When the veterans returned home, they found a mixed reception. Some were welcomed as heroes, while others found no change from when they first left for war.
Even so, many prominent Americans publicly supported the Nisei, and there were some Caucasians who were willing to help the Nisei veterans and their families.
Many veterans took advantage of the GI Bill and graduated from prestigious colleges and schools, earning many degrees.
The many victories the 442nd had during World War II were able to greatly influence the public opinion on Japanese Americans.
In Hawaii, the political, economic, and social impact the 442nd made was life-changing. Many former Nisei GIs joined politics, and by 1945, the Democratic Party of Hawaii was led by them, and they seized control of the territorial politics.
As former President Harry S. Truman said on July 15, 1946, "You fought not only the enemy, but prejudice, and you won."
The 442nd significantly helped with the recession of many discriminatory laws and restrictions.
In 1988, the Civil Liberties Act was signed by former U.S. President Ronald Reagan, issuing reparations for Japanese American internment. He credited the 442nd for this decision.
The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, made up entirely of Japanese Americans, served with immense distinction to defend this nation, their nation. Yet back at home, the soldiers' families were being denied the very freedom for which so many of the soldiers themselves were laying down their lives.
They also helped pave the way for change in the perception and status of Japanese Americans, as well as all Asian Americans in the U.S. Nisei were finally able to join the mainstream of American life, and many were able to hold jobs they couldn't before.
Japanese Americans were tragically forced into internment camps, fueled by fears and prejudice. To combat these and to prove their loyalty, Nisei enlisted in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team to battle in Europe. The 442nd quickly became acclaimed for its battle record and the bravery its men showed in battle. These men left a lasting legacy that truly demonstrated the triumph against discrimination in times of tragedy.